The heavy mahogany doors of Westfield Academy's exam hall swung open, and a stream of students spilled into the golden, lit courtyard. Their laughter and chatter filled the air, but one boy walked out with his head down. His test paper crumpled in his trembling hand. Ethan Montgomery, son of billionaire industrialist Charles Montgomery, was once again the last to leave. His eyes darted nervously to the scarlet numbers at the top of his page 3/800. Another failure. Another reason for his father to look at him with disappointment. Ethan had grown up in a world of privilege. His father's empire stretched across continents, from banking to real estate, and Ethan was expected to inherit it all. Tutors had been hired since he was a child, some of the best professors money could buy, but despite their efforts, he never seemed to measure up. Every exam ended the same way: red ink, low scores, and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. As the other boys slapped each other's backs, comparing their answers and joking about the questions, Ethan lingered by the stone pillars, avoiding eye contact. He could feel their eyes on him. The whispers weren't loud, but he caught fragments. "That's the Montgomery kid, right? Can you believe he failed again? With all that money, and still useless. Wes brains don't come with billions." Each word cut like a blade. Ethan's fists clenched, but he didn't say a word. He just slipped his paper deeper into his bag and walked away from the crowd. At home, the pressure was worse. The Montgomery estate was a palace of glass and steel, towering over the city skyline. Inside, marble floors echoed with footsteps, and priceless art lined the walls. But for Ethan, it never felt like home. That evening, seated at the long dining table, silence hung heavy between father and son. Charles Montgomery sat at the head of a table, tall, stern, his presence dominating the room. He wore the same tailored suit he always did, every inch the billionaire tycoon. His eyes, however, were cold as they scanned the sheet Ethan reluctantly placed before him. Charles' jaw tightened. 38. His voice was quiet, but the disappointment in it was thunderous. "Do you realize what this means?" Ethan lowered his gaze to his untouched plate. He knew what was coming. "I built this empire from nothing." Charles continued, his voice hardening. "Every board member, every investor, every rival, they're watching to see if my son has the strength to lead, and you bring me this." He slapped the paper down. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan whispered, his throat tightening. "I tried." "Trying isn't enough," Charles snapped. "Do you think excuses will keep this company alive? Do you think the world will show mercy because you tried?" Ethan felt the sting of tears, but he refused to let them fall. His father despised weakness. He forced his voice steady. "I'll do better next time." Charles exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "We'll get you another tutor. The best. You'll study twice as hard. No more distractions. If you don't straighten up, Ethan, you won't just fail me. You'll fail yourself." Dinner ended without another word. Ethan pushed food around his plate, appetite gone. That night, alone in his vast room filled with things most kids would dream of, gaming systems, designer clothes, even a private balcony overlooking the city, Ethan sat hunched over his desk. Books sprawled open. But the words on the pages blurred together. Numbers and equations swam before his eyes, and no matter how long he stared, they refused to make sense. He slammed the book shut in frustration, his chest heaving. "Why can't I get this right?" he whispered to himself. His voice broke, the weight of failure pressing on his chest like a stone. Memories flooded back, his father's cold eyes, the mocking whispers at school, the laughter that wasn't aimed at him but always felt like it was. Ethan got up and paced the room, hands buried in his hair. His life was gilded, yet empty. Every luxury felt like a cage. Every expectation like chains. He wasn't dumb. He knew that. He just couldn't seem to learn the way others did. But no one cared about how he learned, they only cared about the results. He thought of running away sometimes, just vanishing, leaving behind the mansion, the school, the pressure. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He was a Montgomery. His father would never allow it. Finally, when the frustration became too much, Ethan grabbed his hoodie and slipped out of his room. He knew the mansion staff wouldn't stop him. They were used to seeing him wander late at night, trying to escape his own thoughts. He ended up at school again the next day, not because he had to, but because it was the only place he could be alone when the hallways were quiet. After classes, He sat on the cold stone steps, staring at the ground. His backpack beside him. The weight of his failures hung heavy, pressing him down until he could barely breathe. And it was there, head in his hands, shoulders slumped, that the sound of a broom brushing across the hallway broke through his despair. Ethan looked up and saw him for the first time. Mr. Johnson, the janitor. A man most students barely noticed. His uniform was faded, his hands worn from years of work, yet his eyes held something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. And without realizing it, Ethan's story was about to change forever. The school courtyard was unusually quiet. The last of the students had gone home, their laughter and footsteps fading into the distance. The golden sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ivy-covered walls of Westfield Academy. Ethan sat on the cold stone steps, his bag at his feet, his chin resting heavily in his hands. The world around him felt far away, muffled. As if he were trapped inside an invisible box. His chest was tight, his mind replaying the same cruel scenes over and over. His father's sharp words, the teacher's disappointed sighs, and the whispers of classmates who believed he was hopeless. The silence was broken by the rhythmic sound of bristles sweeping against stone. Swish, swish, swish. Ethan lifted his head slightly. Across the courtyard, a man moved slowly, broom in hand, gathering fallen leaves into a neat pile. His navy uniform was faded from countless washes, and his hands were rough, evidence of years of hard work. His movements were steady, unhurried, almost like a kind of music. It was Mr. Johnson, the school janitor. Ethan had seen him before in passing, of course. Everyone had. He was part of the background of the academy, always there, always working, but rarely noticed. Students hurried by him without a word. Some didn't even bother to glance at him. But tonight, in the quiet, the man's presence felt different. Evening, young man. Mr. Johnson's voice carried across the empty courtyard, warm and calm. Ethan stiffened. He wasn't used to being addressed by strangers, especially not by staff. Hi, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Mr. Johnson leaned on his broom and studied him for a moment. His eyes were sharp but kind, the kind of eyes that seemed to see deeper than most. You look like the world's sitting heavy on your shoulders. That paper in your bag got something to do with it. Ethan's heart skipped. He hadn't realized the corner of his test paper was still peeking out of his bag, the red mark glaring like a wound. Embarrassment flushed through him. It's nothing, he mumbled. The janitor didn't push, just gave a small smile and went back to sweeping. I've heard that word more times than I can count. Nothing usually means it's something big. Ethan glanced at him, puzzled. Most adults, especially at school, either scolded him or ignored him. But this man's voice carried no judgment. It was gentle, like he actually cared. Mr. Johnson finished sweeping, and leaned the broom against the wall. He walked over slowly and sat a few steps below Ethan. Keeping a respectful distance. He didn't force eye contact, didn't lecture, he just sat there, looking out at the courtyard as if he, too, was lost in thought. You know, he said after a pause, I wasn't much good at school either. Failed plenty of tests, teachers said I was slow. My mama worried I'd never make anything of myself. Ethan blinked, surprised. Really? The janitor chuckled, a deep, warm sound. Oh yes, I was terrible at memorizing. Numbers on a page just danced around, words blurred together. But out in the real world, fixin' things, buildin' things, I could see how it all connected. That's when it started to click. Ethan frowned. What good is that? People only care about grades. My dad, he trailed off, his throat tightening. He couldn't bring himself to admit the depth of his father's disappointment. Mr. Johnson's voice softened. Your father wants what he thinks is best. But sometimes, folks forget that everyone learns different. The world teaches us in many ways, books sure, but also life itself. For the first time that day, Ethan looked directly at him. There was no pity in the janitor's expression, only understanding. Mr. Johnson leaned closer, lowering his voice. You ever notice how the floor tiles in this courtyard are set in a pattern? The angles, the lines, they're all math. Or how this old school building's been standin' for over 100 years. That's history, science too. Knowledge is all around you. The trick ain't memorizing, it's connectin' it to something real. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever explained things like that before. His teachers droned from textbooks, his tutors barked formulas and rules, but none of it ever made sense. Yet the way Mr. Johnson spoke, it felt simple. Almost possible. The janitor stood and picked up his broom again. Tell you what. You meet me here after classes this week. I'll show you a thing or two. Won't cost you a dime, and I don't care what grades you got. Deal. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say no. What could a janitor possibly teach him that all those expensive tutors couldn't? But something in Mr. Johnson's voice, steady and sincere, made him nod. Okay, deal. Mr. Johnson grinned. Good. First lesson starts tomorrow, and the first rule is, you stop calling yourself a failure. You hear me? Ethan's lips curled into the faintest smile, the first in days. I hear you. As he gathered his bag and stood to leave, a strange feeling stirred inside him, not hope exactly, but the fragile beginning of it. For the first time in a long while, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't hopeless after all. He didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter with the janitor would become the turning point of his entire life. The next afternoon, when most of Westfield Academy's students had already left, Ethan lingered in the courtyard, nervously adjusting the straps of his backpack. He wasn't sure why he'd agreed to meet the janitor. Part of him still thought it was ridiculous. After all, he'd been taught by world-renowned tutors, people with PhDs and impressive RA-summas. If they couldn't help him, what could a janitor do? Still, something about Mr. Johnson's calm eyes, his steady voice, had steadied with him. And so here he was, waiting. Right on time, came the warm voice from behind him. Ethan turned. Mr. Johnson walked toward him, a toolbox in one hand, his broom balanced in the other. He set the box down on the steps and smiled. Lesson 1: You don't need fancy books to understand the world. You just need to look at it the right way. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Mr. Johnson crouched, pulled a tape measure from the toolbox, and handed it to Ethan. Measure this step for me. Confused, Ethan extended the tape. Oh, 36 inches. Good. Now, let's say we want to tile this step with squares, each 6 inches wide. How many tiles do we need? Ethan hesitated, the numbers jumbling in his head. Normally, this would be the kind of math problem he'd panic over on a test. But here, with the step right in front of him, the answer came easier. 36 divided by 6 tiles. Mr. Johnson grinned. See, that's division. Not some scary numbers on a page, just a problem you can see and touch. Something clicked in Ethan's mind. For the first time, division made sense. Not as a memorized formula, but as a practical solution. Mr. Johnson wasn't done. He led Ethan across the courtyard to the flower beds. No, look here. These roses. They need sunlight, water, and good soil. That's science, right there. Photosynthesis. You don't need a lab to understand it, you just need to pay attention to life. He plucked a small leaf and held it up. This green color comes from chlorophyll. Plants use it to trap sunlight. That's how they grow. Simple, ain't it? Ethan nodded slowly, curiosity replacing his usual frustration. They spent the next hour moving around the school grounds. Mr. Johnson turned every corner into a classroom. The squeak of the mop bucket became a lesson in friction. Fixing a broken door hinge was an introduction to physics. Even the stained glass windows in the chapel became a story about history, art, and geometry. Ethan found himself laughing for the first time in weeks. This actually makes sense, he admitted, wide-eyed. Mr. Johnson leaned on his broom and looked at him seriously. That's because you're not stupid, son. Never were. You just learn different. The world tells you if you don't fit their way, you're a failure. But the truth is, there's more than one way to be smart. The words hit Ethan like a thunderclap. All his life, he had carried the weight of being called slow, dumb, or unworthy. To hear someone say he wasn't a failure, it felt like oxygen rushing into lungs that had been starved for air. But, Ethan's voice faltered. If I'm not a failure, then why can't I pass tests? Why can't I make my dad proud? Mr. Johnson crouched so he was eye level with him. Because you've been trying to memorize, not understand. Memorization fades, understanding sticks. When you connect lessons to life, they stop being words in a book, they become part of who you are. Ethan swallowed hard. So what's the secret then? The janitor's eyes softened, and he leaned closer, almost whispering. The secret is this: knowledge is everywhere. It ain't locked in classrooms or books. Once you learn to see it, the world itself becomes your teacher. Ethan repeated the words silently, as if engraving them in his heart. Over the following days, their lessons continued. Every evening, while the other students went home to their families, Ethan met Mr. Johnson in quiet corners of the academy. They worked through fractions using the cafeteria trays, learned ratios by mixing cleaning solutions, and discussed history by looking at the worn plaques on the school's walls. Each lesson was wrapped in a story, an image, something real that Ethan could hold on to. Slowly, something began to change in Ethan. The panic that always rose in his chest when he saw numbers or dates began to fade. In its place grew curiosity. Even excitement. He found himself staying up late, not out of despair but because he wanted to explore more. One evening, after solving a tricky math problem about angles by using a broken ladder, Ethan looked at Mr. Johnson with awe. Why didn't anyone ever teach me like this before? But Mr. Johnson's smile was tinged with sadness. Because sometimes, people think only one way counts. They forget that each mind is unique. But don't you forget it, Ethan. You've got a sharp mind. You just needed someone to light the fire. That night, as Ethan walked home beneath the glowing street lamps, his heart felt lighter. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a disappointment. He felt capable. And though he didn't know it yet, the lessons Mr. Johnson was teaching him would soon change not only his grades, but the course of his entire future. The weeks passed like quiet miracles. Each afternoon, after the final bell rang and the students poured out through the academy gates, Ethan stayed behind. While the world assumed he was retreating in shame, he was instead discovering a secret classroom, the halls, courtyards, and corners of Westfield Academy itself, under the guidance of Mr. Johnson. And the change didn't go unnoticed. The first signs it began in small ways. In math class, when the teacher scribbled fractions on the board, Ethan didn't freeze this time. He remembered the janitor's lesson about cafeteria trays. How 4 equal slices made up a whole. His pencil moved, shaky at first, but steady enough to solve the problem. For the first time ever, the answer on his paper was right. He glanced around. No one seemed to notice. But for Ethan, it felt like lightning sparking in his chest. In science, when they studied photosynthesis, Ethan raised his hand. The class went silent. It was rare for him to speak. Plants, they don't eat food like us. They use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make their own. That's why leaves are green. Chlorophyll helps trap the sunlight. The teacher blinked in surprise. That's correct, Ethan. Very good. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Ethan sank lower in his seat. Embarrassed, but deep inside, a seed of confidence had been planted. The whispering crowd, of course, not everyone believed the change. At lunch, Ethan carried his tray to a table, ignoring the usual stares. A group of boys snickered. Hey, Montgomery, one called out. Get another tutor. Or did Daddy buy you the answers this time? Heat rose in Ethan's face, but instead of shrinking away, he met their eyes. No. I studied. The boys laughed, not cruelly, but with disbelief, as if the idea of Ethan studying successfully was a joke. He didn't argue further. Instead, he sat down quietly, his heart pounding, but also steady. For the first time, he didn't feel broken by their words. He knew the truth. He was changing. The exam, the real test, came 2 weeks later. Midterms. The exam hall buzzed with tension as students shuffled their papers. Ethan sat at his desk, palms sweating, but his mind was calm. Mr. Johnson's voice echoed in his head. Knowledge is everywhere. Connect it to what you know. The first problem, geometry. Ethan froze, until he remembered measuring the school steps with Mr. Johnson. He drew a diagram, visualizing the tiles. The solution unfolded. Next, a word problem about mixing solutions. His mind flashed back to the janitor mixing cleaning supplies and explaining ratios. He wrote quickly, the numbers falling into place. History essay described the causes of the Industrial Revolution. Ethan smiled faintly. Just last week, Mr. Johnson had told him a story about his grandfather, who worked in a factory as machines replaced manual labor. The memory gave life to the facts, and the words flowed onto the page. By the time the clock ticked down, Ethan wasn't staring blankly at his paper anymore. He was writing, fast, focused, alive. When he handed in his exam, there was no pit of dread in his stomach. For the first time, he walked out of the hall with his head lifted high. The results a week later, the scores were posted on the bulletin board. Students crowded around, jostling each other to see. Ethan hung back, heart racing. He wasn't sure he wanted to look. But when the crowd thinned, he stepped forward, his eyes scanned the sheet. And there it was. Ethan Montgomery, 82. Not perfect, not the top, but passing, more than passing, solid. Respectable, undeniable. His breath caught. For years he had been the student who always hovered at the bottom. Now, his name sat squarely in the middle. He ran his finger over the number, making sure it was real. Behind him, a voice muttered, "No way, Montgomery actually passed." Another replied, "Maybe his dad finally found the right tutor." Ethan turned, meeting their stares. But this time, he didn't shrink. He didn't explain. He simply smiled, small, proud, and unshakable. At home that evening, Ethan laid the graded exam on the dining table. His father, Charles Montgomery, glanced at it distractedly while sipping his wine. But then his eyes caught the score. He set the glass down, staring at the paper. 82, Charles asked, his tone a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice steady. Charles studied him for a long moment. His expression softened, but only slightly. "Better. This is better. Keep it up." It wasn't praise, not really. But it wasn't anger, either. For Ethan, it was enough. The quiet victory that night, Ethan returned to the courtyard, the same spot where weeks ago he had sat drowning in failure. Mr. Johnson was there, sweeping as always. "Well?" the janitor asked without looking up. Ethan pulled the paper from his bag and held it out. Mr. Johnson leaned on his broom, put on his glasses, and read the score. Then, with a wide grin, he clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "That's what I'm talking about. Hard work, and a little faith in yourself." Ethan's eyes stung, but this time with something new, joy. "I couldn't have done it without you." The janitor shook his head. "I didn't take that test for you. You did it yourself. Don't forget that." For the first time, Ethan believed it. The new Ethan in the weeks that followed, Ethan's confidence grew. He no longer slouched in his chair, no longer avoided raising his hand. He wasn't perfect, he still stumbled, still made mistakes, but he wasn't afraid anymore. Teachers noticed. Students noticed. Even his father noticed. The boy who had once been written off as a failure was beginning to prove everyone wrong. And though the world didn't yet know it, the secret behind his turnaround wasn't expensive tutors or elite methods. It was the wisdom of a humble janitor, who had seen a spark in a boy that everyone else had overlooked. The Montgomery mansion glittered under the chandeliers that evening, hosting one of its grand dinners. The dining room brimmed with board members, investors, and associates of Charles Montgomery's empire. Suits and gowns gleamed, champagne glasses clinked, and conversations buzzed with the language of power. Profits. Mergers and market shares. At the far end of the long table sat Ethan, shoulders straighter than before. He wasn't the same boy who used to avoid his father's gaze. His grades had risen, his confidence grown. Teachers now spoke of his determination. Classmates whispered in surprise at his steady improvements. But none of the guests knew the truth behind his transformation. Charles Montgomery raised his glass. "To legacy," he said, his deep voice commanding the room. "To the future that my son will carry forward." All eyes turned to Ethan, who felt a swell of pride but also a knot of unease. He thought of Mr. Johnson, sweeping the academy halls, unseen by men like these. The man who had given him what no amount of money could buy, belief in himself. Ethan lowered his glass slowly. He couldn't stay silent. "Not tonight. Father," he said, his voice firm but respectful. The room fell quiet. Rarely did Ethan speak at these gatherings. "There's something you should know. About why I've improved." Charles looked at him. Curiosity flickering in his sharp eyes. "Go on." "It wasn't the tutors," Ethan said, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "It wasn't the money or the lessons you arranged. It was someone else. Someone you've never noticed." Whispers rippled across the table. Charles's brow furrowed. But Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "The school janitor. Johnson." Gasps erupted around the table. A few men chuckled under their breath, disbelieving. A janitor, teaching the son of a billionaire. Impossible. Charles's face darkened. "What kind of nonsense is this?" "It's not nonsense," Ethan said, his voice rising with conviction. "Mr. Johnson taught me the one thing no tutor ever did. That knowledge isn't about memorizing books. It's about understanding life. He showed me math in the steps of the courtyard, science in the flowers, history in the walls of the school. He believed in me when no one else did. The room had gone still. The laughter died. There was something in Ethan's voice, raw, honest, that silenced even the skeptics. Charles stared at his son, the weight of his words settling in. Finally, he spoke, his tone sharp. "Bring him here." The invitation the next evening, a black car pulled up to Westfield Academy. The driver stepped out, scanning the empty courtyard, until he found Mr. Johnson pushing his mop bucket across the floor. "Mr. Johnson?" the driver asked. The janitor paused, wary. "Yes, you're requested at the Montgomery estate. Tonight." Mr. Johnson chuckled softly. "Can't say I've ever been requested at a mansion before." But he wiped his hands, changed into his cleanest shirt, and climbed into the car. The meeting, when he entered the grand dining room. The opulence of it nearly overwhelmed him. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, silver platters gleaming under golden light. But Mr. Johnson walked with quiet dignity, his back straight, his gaze steady. Charles Montgomery sat at the head of the table, eyes cold, appraising. Ethan sat nearby, nervous but hopeful. "You're the janitor my son speaks of?" Charles asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "Yes, sir. Mr. Johnson replied evenly. "Name's William Johnson. My son claims you've been tutoring him." Mr. Johnson shook his head gently. "Not tutoring, sir. Just showing him how to see. Knowledge is all around us if you connect it to real life. Your boy's smart. Always was, he just needed someone to help him believe it." Charles studied him, incredulous. "You expect me to believe that a man with no degree, no credentials, succeeded where the finest tutors failed?" Mr. Johnson's eyes didn't waver. "Sometimes, sir, it ain't about credentials. It's about connection. About seeing the person, not just the problem." The silence in the room was thick. Board members shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to anyone speaking so plainly to Charles Montgomery. Ethan finally spoke, his voice breaking through the tension. "Dad, it's true, he gave me the key to learning. He taught me to believe in myself. Without him, I'd still be failing." Charles looked from his son to the janitor, torn between disbelief and the undeniable evidence. His son's transformation. He leaned back slowly, his expression softening for the first time in years. "The offer, Mr. Johnson," Charles said at last. "A man like you shouldn't be pushing a mop. I can offer you a position, education director for the Montgomery Foundation, 6 to use, benefits. A chance to use your methods on a larger scale." The room murmured approval. It was a generous offer, a life-changing one. But Mr. Johnson only smiled, shaking his head. "I appreciate it, sir. Truly. But I don't need riches. I don't need titles. I'm where I'm meant to be, helping kids who get overlooked. If I can make one boy believe in himself, that's enough." Charles blinked, stunned. In his world, everyone had a price. Yet here was a man who valued something greater. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He understood now. Mr. Johnson wasn't just a teacher. He was a man of principle, of humility, of quiet greatness. The revelation. Charles rose to his feet, his voice quieter now, humbled. "Mr. Johnson, I misjudged. You've done for my son what I could not. For that, you have my respect." For the first time in his life, Ethan saw something rare in his father's face: gratitude. Mr. Johnson nodded, tipping his cap. "All I did was remind him of what was already there. Sometimes, all a boy needs is for someone to believe in him." The words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. Ethan looked at Mr. Johnson, his heart swelling with pride and affection. He knew that no matter what future awaited him, whether he inherited his father's empire or forged his own path, he would never forget the man who taught him the real secret of success. And as the janitor walked out of the mansion, back into the quiet night, Ethan knew he wasn't just leaving behind a teacher. He was leaving behind the man who had saved his life.